Hi, my name is Rana. I am the president and CEO of Reasons to Believe, and I want to invite you to watch one of the exciting video recordings from our Scholar Community Workshop held in June of 2023. This workshop explored the question, are we exceptional as human beings? And as part of this workshop, we invited people who held a variety of different perspectives on the question of human exceptionalism to present papers and to engage in dialogue with the hope that this understanding that is generated will help us to produce a robust, biblically faithful, and scientifically credible model for human exceptionalism. I also want you to know that after you watch the video that you can check out some of the resources that we have listed in the description to help you better understand our perspective on human exceptionalism at Reasons to Believe.
What we're going to do here is all 5 of our panelists are going to have 5 minutes to talk about their ideas about animals and Neanderthal. Following that, we're going to have a period where they can interact one with another, but we're going to give as much time as we can to your questions. Those of you who are here, as well as those who are on the live stream. So we want your questions. If you're live stream, you need to get them in to George Haraxon. And for those who are here, go right to the microphone, and we're going to try to get as many questions as possible. Make sure your question's concise. And we'll get to as many people as we can. The way I'd like to approach this is I have a little lineup here. I'd like Erica to go first, followed by Nathan, followed by Fuzz, followed by Kyle, and then Ken will be the 5th one. And one point I'd like to share with you from kind of a logical perspective is I've listened to the talks. There's 2 things that kind of stand out to me as I teach logic. It is very easy to engage in what I would call circular reasoning. And the problem with circular reasoning, or petitio principii is the Latin, begging the question, it's easy to assume what you should prove. And then if you combine that with the confirmation bias, confirmation bias is one of the cognitive biases where it is very easy to go looking for evidence that supports your view and maybe overlook evidence that disconfirms your hypothesis or your view. And I wonder if Erica and Nathan and Fuzz could maybe work a little bit of that into their idea. What I do with my students is I say, look, take your position, but make sure you give me the best argument on the other side. That way I know they're trying to consider all the evidence. So Erica, I'm going to have you go first.
Okay, cool. Can everybody hear me all right? Yeah? Okay, just making sure. Awesome. Okay, yeah, so my position, as I hope was laid clearly in my talk, is that I believe that there is a fairly easy to see continuum at this point in time that humans share with the rest of the animal kingdom, so far as we're considering both the extant or still living organisms alongside the extinct organisms. Now, to the point on whether or not there's a confirmation bias going on here, I can't speak as much to what Nate discussed with regard to animal cognition, but I do know the history of anthropology quite well, and the history of biological anthropology in particular. Human exceptionalism was a given for a very, very long time in this field. In fact, we've been dragged kicking and screaming, into even considering that other hominins were capable of what we can do. The same is true with sort of other living hominids, so things like chimpanzees and bonobos. And in fact, the Leakeys, right when he sent Jane Goodall, the rest of Leakey's angels, basically Leakey sent out Jane Goodall to study chimpanzees, Diane Fossey to study gorillas, and Beirut Galdicus to study orangutans. 3 attractive young women to go study apes because he thought it would get people interested in the topic. And when Jane Goodall reported back that she'd observed chimpanzees using tools, Leakey famously said, we must redefine the definition of man, redefine the definition of tool, or accept chimpanzees as human, because up until that point, exclusively humans were thought to utilize tools. The same was thought for things like burial, like art, like wearing clothes, like the ability to potentially utilize things like symbolism or to speak. And slowly, as we've uncovered more and more hominins in the fossil record, we've seen this gap shrink, and we've seen the acquisition of our traits become more gradual with time. I think we're going to continue to see that. There is no doubt in my mind that today humans are exceptional as organisms. We are fascinating creatures, and we're the only ones sitting here having a conversation about whether or not we're exceptional. And I think that in and of itself deserves attention. But I think to not appreciate the sort of scope as to how we reached this point is to lose a massive part of the question, are we exceptional? Because in space, perhaps, in time, not so much, I don't think. And so to kind of, I guess, sum things up for myself, I do think we can see the acquisition of the human condition through time, and I think we can see the majority of what we once considered exceptional additionally in other and I specifically focus on apes, non-human hominids today. So I'll set that.
And maybe just a little bit about how do you combat confirmation bias, assuming what you should prove? How do you try to make sure that doesn't happen?
Me as an individual?
Yeah.
I mean, I try to go in with no assumptions. In science, what they train us to do, hopefully, is you want to try to kill your hypothesis more than anything, because if your hypothesis can stand the tests that you throw at it, knowing it better than anyone else, then it becomes better off for it. The point is to try to prove yourself wrong. And of course, in actual science, this is not always how it hashes out. That's how I try to conduct myself in what I do. And I'm sure I'm human, like everybody else, right? I make mistakes, and I'm sure I fall victim to confirmation bias just as anybody else does. But I do my best to try to, when considering things like human exceptionalism, the first thing I think of is I make a list of things that I think humans are exceptional at. And then I go to search to see if there's anything, if we can find these characteristics in anything else. I was shocked that chimpanzees have shown anything even close to imagination. I didn't know that before actually going into this weekend, really. So I think it's important to constantly try and challenge ourselves in order to keep confirmation bias from creeping in and be open to challenges.
Very good. Nathan?
Well, I'll get to the confirmation bias in the second half. But the human exceptionalism is a field a way of thinking that we've had for a very long time, and I think that it's generally done more harm than good in terms of the science. I think that for other reasons, philosophical, theological, and so forth, it's important. But scientifically, it's created a sort of species chauvinism, and it's very easy to declare ourselves the best at things when we're the ones doing the measuring, right? And in fact, that kind of bias is what led us to our state of ignorance of animal cognition. What I mean by that is, we were asking chimpanzees if they recognize themselves the way that we recognize ourselves, instead of asking if they recognize themselves in chimpanzee kinds of ways. And in fact, actually, it's even worse than that. We used to use dogs a lot of times as our indicators of what animals can do. But we forget that that dogs were domesticated. So they are, by design, by evolution, attuned to human emotion and human responses. And so, for example, they can follow our gaze. Like if you look in a certain direction, your dog will look in that direction. I use that as an example of something that we would have been able to spot. But wolves don't do that. But they do follow each other's gaze. So if we said dogs are smarter than wolves because they follow our gaze and wolves don't. Wolves don't give a crap about our gaze. That's the difference. And dogs do, by design. They are very attuned to our emotional states, what we're doing, and interpreting human behavior was their key to survival. Right? They self-domesticated by just being good companions. So I just use this as an example that once you ask the question differently, do wolves respond to each other's gaze? Of course they do. And they're very well attuned. And in fact, those skills in being sensitive to each other's state, physical state, emotional state, is what made it so adaptable to the human companions. So I use that just as an example. So if we want to understand chimpanzee cognition, we have to see how do they operate as chimpanzees in chimpanzee environments, in the ecology, environment, social environment especially, that they naturally occur in. And that was Jane Goodall's great contribution. She was the first one who actually just watched how they lived for a couple of decades, and she came back with all of this knowledge. We didn't know anything about chimpanzees before Jane Goodall. And remember, she's still alive. This is not ancient history, right? What we knew is we put them in cages and watched what they could do in this incredibly stressful and artificial, isolating environment. And not surprisingly, we found them capable of very little in that environment. So once we've kind of opened up our minds and see how things actually live, but therein is the problem when it comes to Neanderthals, because there's just no way to do that. So we have to piece together what we can from the artifacts. And I think that that is where we are so sensitive to finding what we're looking for, or not finding what we think is not there, because what is left in the fossil record is the tiniest sliver of what was once there, right? The odds of a living thing becoming a fossil, are 1,000,000 to 1. And an artifact even less so, because they're ephemeral by design, right? So we have just these tiny little glimpses. And so what you have in anthropology is camps. Those who believe that Neanderthals had symbolic thought, those who believe they didn't, those who believe they could speak, and those who believe that they couldn't. They already come in with that, and they interpret the evidence according to that. Now, I'd like to think, as a field, we're better than that, maybe, because together we'll hopefully move it along that way, but individuals are very, very biased, and the idea that scientists are any less biased than other humans is another one we need to confront and be honest about. We do bring in our prejudices and our biases, and it colors the way we do our work. So what are Neanderthals capable of, and how do we approach that question without bias when all we have are some bones and rocks and sticks and stuff? So what you do is you make a hypothesis. And what's great about a hypothesis is that if it does have assumptions baked into it, they're tested also. So when you test a hypothesis, you also test the foundation on which it's built. So gradually, the most underneath things start to get firmer and firmer and firmer. So the idea that Neanderthals communicated with complex language that's baked into so many different kinds of research that I think now pretty much everybody agrees that they did. Did they have the subjunctive mood and things like that in their language? I don't know. But they certainly did communicate. And there's no other way, for example, to explain why they have the evolution of the hyoid bone and the larynx structure that they had. It seems like they definitely made some sounds for the sake of it, including vowel sounds like we make. But I'm assuming that would be the only function of it, because what else can you do? But you build these hypotheses on top of assumptions that hopefully test them all, and you don't run away from data that you don't agree with. But we're not perfect. We're all very biased and prejudiced, and that's what I think the community is supposed to take. That's the logic of the scientific method, is that it doesn't rely on anyone being right or anyone being free of prejudice, but rather the community as a whole is greater than the sum of the individuals, and so those flaws kind of cancel out.
Great, Nathan. Fuzz, we're going to go to you.
Yeah. Well, in terms of how do I prevent circular reasoning and confirmation bias, well, one way is inviting Eric and Nathan to come here and to present my best case in front of people who have the wherewithal to evaluate it and to offer a counter argument or a counter perspective. So I'm very grateful, by the way, again, that both of you are willing to come here. You sacrifice time, and it's not an easy thing to do. Hopefully this isn't a hostile environment, but you are walking into a place where you are outliers in the sense that you hold differing perspectives than almost everybody in the room. So I appreciate that. And with respect to Neanderthals, I mean, there's so many thoughts swirling in my mind. I appreciate the point about human exceptionalism maybe creating issues in primatology and anthropology, but at times it feels like the pendulum is maybe swung so hard in the other direction that we're seeing Neanderthal exceptionalism when it may not actually be there, that there's an attempt to do a corrective. And just as a case in point, I mean, I can pick up a journal article and look at the author list. I don't have to even look at the title, and I can tell you from the author list that the conclusions are that Neanderthals had symbolic capability, not even knowing what the actual content of the paper is. And so there does appear to be these camps, and there does appear to be, maybe agenda isn't a strong word, but there does seem to be confirmation bias. And when you're looking at the archaeological record, you're trying to take a dearth of remains, you're trying to establish correlations, and then you're trying to create a narrative, to explain what it is that you're seeing. And, and I would actually, take exception with the last point, one of the last points you made, Erica, that for example, the bone flute or even the use of fire, Neanderthals looked like they used fire, but it very well may have been opportunistic. The burials, there's dispute about whether they're ritualistic. So there are, and I've written blogs about it, and these are also found in Who Was Adam, the references to these places where those claims were challenged. So to me, I think it's the best you can say is that it's disputed that Neanderthals had these capabilities. They very well may have, but I don't think that you can draw that conclusion based on what is published in the totality of the scientific literature. And one of the things that I wonder, and this is as much a question as anything else, is why isn't the archaeological record for Neanderthals viewed through the lens of Neanderthal biology or brain biology and brain physiology? Because, to me, one of the most incredible scientific achievements has been the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. And to have the high-quality genome for Neanderthals and for Denisovans is absolutely mind-blowing to think that that was achieved. But it now gives us the opportunity to do some very interesting comparative genomics. And you do see there's about 100 genes that are different in humans and Neanderthals, and a number of those genes are known to be involved in cognitive development. And you now have this, the opportunity to do experimental work with Neanderthalizing human brain organoids and directly testing what those genetic differences are. And there's been 4 or 5 studies done with that approach, all indicate consistently that Neanderthals likely were cognitively inferior based on the physiology, the physiological function of those genes. I mean, it's also remarkable that you can actually go into the Neanderthal genome and get an insight into gene expression and into epigenetics and the methylation patterns in the genome. And again, you see differences, and in many places, those differences are also, again, associated with genes that are involved in cognitive development. Recently, I was looking through a paper on the gene deserts that are found in the Neanderthal gene deserts found in the human genome. And again, you see genes in those gene deserts that seem to be involved in cognitive development. And the authors of the paper argue that this is an indirect way of making the case for, I wouldn't say human exceptionalism, but the advanced cognitive differences in humans and Neanderthals. So my question is, why isn't that then the lens by which we would look through at the archaeological record, right? Where it does seem like you can build a case that there was, again, cognitive inferiority in Neanderthals, such that maybe attributing symbolic behavior or sophisticated behavior to them, when we look at the archaeological record, may be not a fair interpretation. And I wonder if this counterbalance to the influence of human exceptionalism is actually creating, again, a bias.
Let's come back to that. I want to hear Erica and Nathan respond to that. But I want to move over into this direction. And Kyle, you have 5 minutes.
Okay.
Tell us everything you know.
All right. I'm glad you asked. No, I really have enjoying, especially because of everything that's already been said, that we're discussing methodology. But one thing I wanted to kind of emphasize, coming from the philosophical perspective, because as far as like my view, I take pretty much the view that Fuzz discussed in his talk. I just come from it from more of a classical philosophical perspective. But one thing I wanted to emphasize is that one of the reasons, from like classical Christian philosophy, for example, to believe that humans are exceptional, it really does we can trace it all the way back to the ancient Christian philosophers and the medievals adopting Aristotle's view of, his idea of the different kinds of souls. And he thinks that what distinguishes humans from non-human animals is that we're rational animals. And I just wanted to say that, there are good philosophical arguments that argue that in principle, unless you have some kind of immaterial aspect to you, you can't be rational. And it really kind of traces back to what Ken was talking about yesterday with the realism-nominalism debate. Realism is this view that there are, in reality, there are these abstract objects that explain why certain things have similar properties. And the idea is that if you don't have this kind of immaterial aspect to you, you can't take in these abstract objects and know reality as it is. And that's one of the reasons why we think that right, so there's so many different philosophical and theological things that go with it. So we think that unless you're able to take in abstract objects, you can't understand the world as it is, you can't reason about the world. Someone mentioned counterfactuals earlier. But also, having a soul makes it so that we are capable of having free will, right? C.S. Lewis emphasizes that it's actually irrational. He argues that it's irrational to believe that you don't have a soul, because the idea is if everything about you is physical, then everything about you is controlled through the laws of nature. So even your very beliefs would, the reason why I hold the beliefs I do, the reasons for holding those beliefs would be physical, not rational. But besides things like that, is theologically, the idea that there's something about us that's immaterial that doesn't rely on the existence of our physical body is what we think makes personal continuity after your body's gone possible. It makes sense out of the resurrection and many other things. And the fun thing that I've always enjoyed about being here at RTB is that I start to think more scientifically, and that's kind of what is driving our idea with human exceptionalism, is this idea that, okay, so it's this capacity for higher order abstract reasoning that sets us apart. And what we want to do is when we look at non-human animals, when we look at the evidence concerning Neanderthals, we want to see evidence of those abilities. And if we don't see it, then we say, okay, they're not human. And if we do see it, then it starts to get more on that side of being questionable. And when I study, when I kind of dip my toes into comparative psychology and was trying to study the difference between humans and non-human animals from that comparative psychology perspective, I felt myself, like I was worried because, as a Christian so I have reasons to believe that the soul exists, but like biblically we say that, like it talks about humans are the only thing created in the image of God. So when I was studying humans and non-human animals, I felt, compelled to if something looks questionable, then maybe I'm just going to be like, okay, well, there's reason to doubt that this is higher, this activity from animals is explainable through higher order symbolic thought. But I found it interesting because whenever I started studying the evidence concerning Neanderthals, I don't know what Ken might want to say, but like it seems like the Bible is silent on it. And obviously from what Erica showed us, right, there's so much continuity between humans and Neanderthals that it really is, from a Christian perspective, questionable. Were these human? Were they not? But as a Christian, as a theist, I don't have this, I'm not compelled to try to find a connection between like a universal common ancestor and humanity. So I almost feel like I'm less, like I'm really just open to the evidence. But having said that, and I don't want to take up all the time, I'm sorry, I didn't get 45 minutes to talk, but I learned about Morgan's canon whenever I was studying animals for my dissertation. I found it interesting that that's been debated. Morgan's canon was a thing, and they still teach that in intro to animal cognition textbooks. But a position I found from a philosopher of science that I thought was really reasonable, I think it's Simon Fitzpatrick. He argued for something he called evidentialism. And I think we could apply it in both comparative psychology and while we're studying Neanderthals. And the idea was, it was kind of a middle ground between Morgan's canon, trying to say, because if y'all didn't hear, Morgan's canon is the idea that if you can explain animal behavior just through some kind of lower order process like associative learning, like the only reason you should attribute human-like behavior and abilities to them is if that's the only inference left to you. So if you can explain their behavior in lower order terms, then do that. Well, Fitzpatrick said, well, okay, so we've seen, sometimes we think that maybe Morgan's canon makes us biased the other way. So his argument was just that if you have more than one option, then there's, unless like you can reason that there's higher order processes involved or lower order processes involved, unless you can just eliminate both options, you really shouldn't come down on one side or the other. And I thought it was a really reasonable thing. But I will say, and Fuzz mentioned this, is that the amount of time the hominids were on the earth with the lack of advancement, not necessarily survivability, but the lack of advancement in culture and technology really, I think, pushes me more to the Morgan's canon side. And from whenever I've studied, from what I've studied, when I look at the evidence concerning the Neanderthal behavior, and I do see some researchers saying, well, we think we can explain this through lower order processes that don't involve symbolic thought, I think I'm more attuned to agree with them.
Thanks, Kyle. Ken?
Well, I came to this conference with the hope that I would learn something about Neanderthals, because I am a layperson in that area. I mean, I've read the various books by Hugh or Ian Tattersall or somebody like that, and I've not been disappointed. This morning has been magnificent in terms of all three presentations, just what we've heard and what I learned. So I want to thank the speakers this morning. You heard me last night say that I wish they were still here, that, you know, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens evidently were together on Earth for tens of thousands of years. I think that would have been cool to you know, it would have answered a few questions if they were just here. Which brings up a couple of questions. You know, evidently, I don't think anybody disagrees that there was interbreeding. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, well then, was that rape or was it cohabitation? I think either answer will be interesting. If it was cohabitation, then what does that look like, and what are we talking about? And then it brings up the question: okay, did Neanderthals disappear by extinction or by assimilation? I mean, those are just questions that come to my mind. There were several other things. Erica's chart, where it showed, you know, where the chart just goes straight up, it raised the question to me, and I'd love to hear you talk a bit about it. Is there sort of a biological version of fine-tuning in which everything is just so remarkably one thing after another, so this narrow convergence? I'd like to hear more about that. My understanding is that, not thinking about Neanderthals, but thinking about Homo sapiens, that our brains are about 10% smaller than Homo sapiens of, you know, yeah. Are we more stupid? I mean, you know, are we getting dumber? Take a look at social media. You may wonder. You know, so the whole idea of brain size, I thought that was interesting what she said about. I mean, we've always usually used the brain size to body size ratio as the criteria, and so that I'd like to hear more about that. Erica, you brought up that you said that you thought that chimpanzees exhibited guilt. That's guilt or shame? I'd like for you to, you know, I'd like to hear more about that. If you you know, what would you understand to be the markers of guilt or the markers of shame? Because those are not the same things, you know. And so that would be, I'd like to hear more about that. Yeah.
Very good. Well, let's go to Erica and Nathan, and let's hear their responses to some of these things that have been raised.
You want me to go first, Nate?
I got stuff to say.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts. First, to your point, Fuzz, about the potential, overcorrection with Neanderthals. Being in the field right now, I would say that we're seeing quite the opposite of that. This past year, tools were assigned to Paranthropus. This is a hominin that has a very small brain case size, and yet it's associated with these Oldowan tools, as well as this stuff with Homo naledi from last week and earlier. And there is just a great disagreement and contention within the anthropological community about both, because it's supposed to be only late genus Homo. Supposed to be is like the attitude that you're getting from the field. So there's actually quite a bit of pushback in favor of human exceptionalism from a lot of folks within anthropology. Perhaps not so much towards Neanderthals these days, but broadening that, there's still a resistance there. So if you want to argue the overcorrection exists, but only in Neanderthals, perhaps, but I would say overall we still exist with Homo sapiens quite well on this pedestal, and maybe it should be that way, or maybe it shouldn't. I don't think Neanderthals were capable of literally everything that humans were. I think it's evident that we're the only ones here. Clearly something was in our favor. I don't think it's very likely that that was entirely up to chance. Even if it was just that we were more equipped to handle change than they were, that still makes us different in a way that is superior, as you might say. I think that we've talked about this before, Fuzz, but one thing I want to bring up is that we're talking about a difference in degree versus kind, not whether or not there's a difference, because I agree that there's a difference. I'm just arguing that that difference is an exacerbation along a continuum, that what humans have done is take a condition, kind of elevate it, but that it still comes from a precursor, and that Neanderthals perhaps exhibited a form of that precursor that maybe in the past we didn't give them as much credit for as being as close to us as perhaps they are. And case in point to that, a paper was released, I believe, last year, maybe a year and a half ago, on a single base pair mutation in a gene that exists in modern humans to the exclusion of archaic humans, so Homo sapiens 300,000 years ago, and Neanderthals. It was a substitution of arginine for lysine. And this one single substitution that is thought to have occurred around, interestingly enough, your proposal for the emergence of what I would say definite symbolism, although I would propose Neanderthals had a form of that, it triples the production of radial glial cells. It's a mutation in transketolase like 1. What that means is that we're taking a previous condition and amplifying it, a difference in degree, not in kind. Still a magnificent difference and a remarkable change, but not one that is categorically unique, I would say, to your points.
Nathan?
I think, once again, we're using a very human-specific measuring stick for some of these things. And so when Fuzz was mentioning some studies about the genes, I don't think we know at all that certain genes are associated with cognitive superiority or even specific abilities, just differences in cognitive development and not even cognitive development, anatomical development. So we know in the Neanderthal genome there have been this is hard to say. There have been more changes that we've associated with cognitive development than in other areas. But even that's somewhat disputed because there's just a lot of genes required for cognitive development. So the fact that 100 genes are different and a majority of them have to do with cognitive development, well, a majority of genes have to do with cognitive development. So that was sort of, I don't know if there's that much enrichment there. But there is, and the differences that we have, we don't know near enough to say that one is superior. And I even think even the terminology of superior is different is incorrect because it's a difference. Their cognition was different than ours. I don't think anybody disputes that. Was their cognition less than ours? Inferior to ours? I mean, who are we to say that? Except for our species chauvinism that assumes this is the best, this is the highest, but there's kinds of cognitions that we don't even have that other animals have. So if we were to measure all kinds of, there are blind animals that can see this room better than us through echolocation. Right? Because in addition to just seeing where things are, they also have some measure of depth, and sometimes they can even get some measure of the surface, what kind of surface it is, which you can't do from vision, but you can from echolocation. So we would say, are we stupider than bats or dolphins? No, they just have this form of cognition that we don't have at all. And so the cognition that Neanderthals have and that humans have, I would say, is so similar. But the reorganization of the brain certainly did open up some kind of difference, so that humans have a form of cognition, or I shouldn't even say it's a form of cognition, should have an integration of cognition. And it seems to be associated with a larger number of neurons, which we haven't talked about yet. But I think the days of measuring brain mass versus body mass, the days are numbered where that's going to be the important thing. Because we're actually going back to absolute number of neurons as probably more informative than just brain mass versus body mass. Because we don't know how many neurons Neanderthals had, for example. Their brain was bigger, but that doesn't mean it has more neurons necessarily. What if it had more connections? And in that case, they're almost certainly going to have outpace us in a number of different forms of cognition. And the Morgan's Canon, the book that I mentioned that I think you all should read, there's a very deep takedown of Morgan's Canon that Franz de Waal wrote in his most recent book, or 2 books ago. Just the idea being that, and even just Occam's razor itself, I think we're realizing that every single thing that we look at actually ends up being way more complex than we thought. And this idea of just reducing it to its most simplest things leads us to the truth faster. I don't know that that's true anymore. So appreciating differences without assigning superiority, inferiority, I think that's something that we should focus on a little bit more. But over extrapolation of sparse evidence is going to be a problem on both sides, that's for sure, because the tiniest evidence is really all we have.
Fuzz, questions, comments here?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Neither of you addressed the potential problem or complication with anthropomorphism, and just kind of curious, more so than anything else. And then for Nathan, I'm just curious what you think of, if you're familiar with Johann Lind's work and what you think about his assertion. Well, it's not like really an assertion. He's got computer modeling that backs it up, that associative learning may actually explain animal intelligence, and that it's what they're doing is remarkable, but fundamentally different than what we do because of symbolic capabilities.
The one thing I'd say about that is I think the idea of symbolic thought as another input into your own integration. So remember I was talking about before about modularity. So you have all of these inputs that go into your cerebrum, which gives you your sense of the world as you understand it. Because you don't consciously sort vision from hearing, from memories, from all these things. It's just you have an experience, right? And it's all continuous and unified with all these inputs. But what we have a lot of is inputs from within the brain itself, which is our memory, our personality, everything that's brought us to this moment is also putting an input into our experience right now, right? And I think we have a lot of that. And I think our brain, the largest expansion of our brain that we've seen is in exactly those areas where it feeds back into itself. So I think we bring with us to every moment of our lives a richness of our experience that is unmatched by any other animal, I would say. Because I'm not, of course, animals have memories and they learn or whatever, but I think it's a fraction of what we learn in detail. And that is an input of itself into our cognitive experience. But Neanderthals had bigger brains than us. They did. They whether it was more number or not, so they probably had that too. But what they didn't have, I think, that led to that meant that we outpaced them in technological development was language. I think the complexity of language offered us the ability to have division of labor, and I don't just mean like you cook, I clean, but I mean across the board, all kinds of cultural knowledge gets distributed among the group. And then as the group size swelled, our cumulative knowledge swelled. A library of 10,000 books has a lot more information in it than a library of 10 books. And I think that our library got so large and just started feeding it in itself, and that's that hockey stick you see as we just really, sort of put everything together. We didn't have to relearn anything from generation to generation. We just added on more and more and more and distributed the knowledge, and the population swelled. And we know this is true because there have been examples where populations shrunk very small, and they lost all kinds of technology for tens of thousands of years because they didn't have critical mass to sustain the knowledge necessary for that technology. One person can't know it all. One person can know one thing, and so when you lose that knowledge, it goes away forever. So it's almost like we have a distributed intelligence amongst the community. And think about that. Every single piece of learning that you've ever done in your life pretty much was social, right? If you read a book, somebody else wrote that book. Almost everything you do is a social sort of learning. And so that's what David Sloan Wilson calls evolution and warp drive, because it's cultural evolution. We don't wait for our bodies and mutations anymore, right? We don't solve any of our problems with mutations anymore. We solve them with each other, basically. So I think probably the edge that we would have had over Neanderthals in terms of technological development and advancement, all that, was in cultural evolution.
Erica, how about this anthropomorphizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at other animals in the past, and it's especially difficult when you're looking along the line of hominin evolution. But I think an easy way to kind of break free of anthropomorphization is to take the things that we know only humans do today, like make art, like make jewelry, like wear clothes, utilize fire, these kinds of things. And those are distinctly, at least with regard to today, categorically human. And if we find them in the past, I think it's not anthropomorphization to say, okay, well, they're doing a thing that only humans do today. That makes them human, or at least approaching it. And I think it's quite telling that we see the emergence of this suite of technologies through time. It doesn't show up all at once. You know, first we find simple stone tools, then more advanced stone tools and fire, and then even more advanced stone tools and cooking and clothes and taking care of the dead, burying the dead and taking care of the sick. This acquisition is slow and clockable, and as Nate said, that's just a fraction of what they were probably doing, because it's just what we have preserved. I think often about how many tools chimpanzees use today. Their toolbox is enormous. Most of it is vegetation, and people in the future will have no idea what they were capable of. If some alien civilization or something came down and found them, they would have no idea other than that they use stone tools. It wouldn't surprise me at all if some of these earlier hominins were using way more than just stone tools to accomplish various tasks, but they're using like sticks and twigs and water skins and things like that simply don't preserve. To Nate's point as well, if you took me and dropped me on a desert island and, again, this alien civilization came and found me, they would think I was no more advanced than Homo habilis. All I would be capable of doing is making very rudimentary stone tools, maybe some kind of shelter. They could look at my brain and say, oh, well, her brain was pretty big, but I guess she was still kind of dumb because she didn't do very much. So Nate's point of cumulative knowledge is absolutely critical. Neanderthals lived in tiny groups. We know this for a fact through their genomes because they were incredibly inbred. This doesn't happen in large groups. It happens exclusively in small groups. And so because of that would have been a massive blockade for their technological advancement. Who do they have to bounce ideas off of? I mean, when we look at technological spikes in human history, where do they happen? Well, a lot of them happen between like Europe and Asia, where this massive two land masses meet, and there's plenty of opportunity for exchange. At choke points where human populations can't cross big geographic barriers, people get isolated. They lose technology. They can't exchange information, and they can't build this library of knowledge. So the deck was stacked against Neanderthals from the start, I think, in a lot of this. But it doesn't help that I do agree that they probably weren't working with the full equipment that humans were. But to say all of that and then to look at their genome and to look at their technology and to look at their morphology and say that humans are categorically different, I don't think is doable, because it is a twisting of a dial, right? Not the changing of a tool is what I would say.
I'll keep it less than a minute. I think the small group is an underappreciated fact, because they were pretty thin on the ground all the way through, and they really didn't make it through the last glaciation. So it was the extra small groups that were spread apart in time and space. But at that point in time, let's say, 70,000 years ago, they were not less advanced than us on almost any, even using our human chauvinistic way of doing it. Even then, we were basically on par with technology and art and everything else to the best of our ability to understand humans and Neanderthals. And we have done very little evolution since that time, biologically, almost none. So if you were to drop a Neanderthal into human culture right now, how well would it integrate and all of that? I don't know. If you dropped a human into Neanderthal culture, he would not be like the king, the philosopher king. I don't think he would be any better than any of the other Neanderthals as an individual, right? I think what made us, after the last glaciation and our group size swelled, cultural evolution took over. And we probably did have unique advantages in the brain for that, which is a social memory. And by the way, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I think this is still true, that primate brain size and power correlates pretty well with group size. So it's the social intelligence hypothesis that really what made us smart was just our groups got bigger, we have to maintain more relationships, and all of that takes a lot of brain.
Dunbar's idea.
Yeah, Dunbar's relationship between group size and brain size. So, I mean, I think that's the rub, is that we got a big enough brain so that we can live in big enough groups that we really didn't have to be that smart as individuals, but we were smart as big groups. So I don't think as individuals Neanderthals were less smart than us. They just didn't have what we have in terms of social ability to build it all up together.
I wonder if Eric or Nathan has questions they may want to ask other panel members.
This is your opportunity.
Yeah. So I had a question. I'll see if I can hopefully recall it from your talk yesterday, actually. I'm curious. So coming from the perspective of not starting with sort of a Christian worldview, I found it hard to reach the conclusion of exceptionalism because so much of it everybody mentioned there's like this spiritual component. And like from my perspective, I'm thinking to myself, okay, if you want to make spirituality the line, I can't say anything to that. I can't prove that scientifically. I can't investigate that scientifically. I don't know if there's even any support for Neanderthals having religion or not. I don't know. I know people have proposed it. They've got these weird circle arrangements that they make. So my question is, do you think the case for human exceptionalism can be made without using, and I don't want to say presupposition, but I suppose without using a starting point of Christianity?
So define exceptionalism. No, I mean it, because are you talking, okay, that humans are persons? And if you remember, person is very much a theological concept to begin with. And that's one of the problems we're having, in that so many of the terms that are being used in Western civilization to describe humans have a Christian origin. In other words, what I would say to my secular friends is that you've borrowed from a Christian worldview more than you perhaps realize. And that, so therefore, to even ask the question about human exceptionalism, why would you even be asking about human exceptionalism unless you were operating from something that sees humans as spiritually different? And so I would say that we're all drinking the same water more than you may realize. That say, well, I mean, how else would you operate in a Western system unless you're accepting some of the major concepts of, I mean, ask exceptionalism. Are you talking about free will? Well, do you believe in free will? Are you talking about personhood? Well, do you believe that there is such a thing as persons? Or is this just some construct that we use that it's very convenient? So what would you mean by exceptionalism?
I mean, I suppose I'm thinking of it more, I don't know, Nate, you correct me if you're coming from sort of a different perspective here, but I'm sort of thinking of like the dynamic pattern that makes up a human in the context, like placed within the context of the biological world, like how Linnaeus would have tried to conceptualize the place of humans. So perhaps, this is me being scared of philosophy, but like perhaps leaving the philosophical behind, like from a cognitive, physical, and social standpoint, can a line be drawn between humans and either the fossil record or extant critters, without starting with an imago Dei, as you said.
But you're incredibly curious about this.
I'm interested, yeah.
Yes. So where did that come from, and why is that important? Why would it matter?
Curiosity?
Yeah. Why?
Because I'm empathetic and I want to share your perspective.
Okay, so, but that goes to the point. You study chimpanzees because you find them incredibly fascinating.
And familiar.
Yeah. And yet, and I think this is something that many have commented on, is that they don't reciprocate. In other words, what we find is this incredible lack of curiosity in the animal kingdom. mean, cats are curious a bit, but doesn't it say something about you that you have this almost insatiable desire to know?
I think extant human curiosity, like I said with regard to my talk earlier, stands apart. But we're the only ones sitting here asking these questions. Like, there's no equivalent chimpanzee conference anywhere.
Well, there you go. In other words, there's nothing from a evolutionary natural selection perspective that is going to help the species survive that much better by the fact that you are a paleontologist.
But perhaps it helped Neanderthals survive because we
maybe.
carry their genes today,
Well,
and those of Denisovans.
My point is, going back to the fact that you're asking how would I, from just looking at it biologically, I said, well, just take a look at yourself. I think that, quite honestly, I think one of the great evidences of the existence of God is you.
Oh, my
Yeah.
goodness, what a large compliment.
You are an image bearer. Whenever I see you, and whenever you see me, and we all see each other,
too.
and Kyle,
Especially Kyle.
we are amazing. I mean, yes, there is this. I mean, biologically, if we're going to dissect a human and a chimpanzee side by side, we're going to find all kinds of anatomical things that are similar. But the things that are making us exceptional are the kind of things it's very hard to put in a vial or in a petri dish.
Do you think it's not quite telling, though, that we can see the emergence of a lot of the characteristics that make us unique today through geologic time, as if they, as you said earlier, they emerge. It's not an instant. It's gradual. And I think, to that point, like, we would be remiss to simply, as I said in my talk, compare us to extant chimpanzees, because I agree, there's a gap there. We're different critters. We specialize in different things. But outside of perhaps spirituality, which I will cop to here, I don't know that there's anything that we do today that we can't see a precursor for. And and with regard to spirituality, can we even investigate that? Is it within the purview of science at all? I don't know.
And those are great questions. And that's one of the reasons why like I said, I wanted to hear more about Neanderthals and just how are we to understand Neanderthals. I go back, I know I asked the question, if they interbred, what kind of relationship were humans and Neanderthals having? I mean, there's different types of interbreeding. If it was a hostile encounter, then okay, there's that. But if we're talking about something where they interbred because they were cohabiting, this means there's some kind of long-term, lifelong relationship that is going on, and I haven't heard anybody to talk about that. I mean, I would like to hear more, because you think about how did that happen, and do you have any empirical evidence? This question: is there any empirical evidence that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals lived together?
No, and I think there's a lot of evidence against it. And one of those is that the gene pools didn't merge. They just didn't. So when you have two species that can interbreed, if they do, you lose the distinctiveness. I mean, you can have local variation, but that's how speciation works, is that some kind of barrier has to exist for a certain amount of time. And that's why we don't call ourselves hybrid human Neanderthals. We say it's introgression, meaning genes from one gene pool to another without merging. The gene pools did not merge. In fact, there's evidence for hybrid sterility. So probably, the introgression events were sort of not few and far between, but were moments rather than lifestyles.
But that doesn't sound like cohabiting then.
Yeah, but it's something that we have only the vaguest, inferences about. But yeah, I don't think most people would say that there was a cohabitation.
Well, I mean, the reason we're asking this is because there are modern humans today I heard numbers as high as 3%?
5.
5%. That's, to a lay person, that sounds very significant, especially this many tens of thousands of years later.
Well, I mean, so the population numbers were very, very low, right? And we talk about population bottlenecks and founder effects, so you can have, a very small gene pool that expands out. And the fact that we can kind of pinpoint the age of these introgression events that's another piece of evidence that they were just sort of moments in time rather than lifestyles. But I want to get back to the point about curiosity, because I had a thought on that. So we are a very curious species, and I think what that comes from is we are the ultimate generalists. So in ecology, you talk about species who are generalists and species who are specialists. Generally, in the short term, being a specialist is good, but in the long term, being a generalist is good, because then you're adaptable to different climates, things change, and you're not screwed. So humans became, when we left the rainforest, or actually the better way to say it is the grasslands came to us when the rainforest shrunk, we found ourselves having to live in a different way. And that set us on this trajectory of just being generalists all the time. Every environment we went in, humans lived in different ways. We eat different foods in different environments, different foods, different structures, coastal populations. There's so many different ways that humans were living as hunter-gatherers. So I'm not talking about now, I'm talking about then. The ultimate generalist. Well, how do you succeed as a generalist other than by observing and learning all that you can about your environment? I think curiosity actually was an instinct, a drive that really helped us survive that, okay, we're not in the rainforest anymore. We now have to figure out how to live, in the border, in the grassland. Of course, this is taking place over tens of thousands of years, well, hundreds of thousands of years probably. But the curiosity, that drive to absorb as much information as we could, integrate it, and figure out how to live, I think that is what really set us on that different trajectory. We are a curious, insatiably curious people. That's why I'm so curious about you and you about me, because it's baked into who we are to gather as much information as we can from every sort of pattern recognition. We over-interpret patterns all the time because we are programmed to look for patterns, to look for how to figure things out. Now, I'm not saying other creatures don't do this, but we do it a lot, and I think that that is also a key to human nature, or you might say the human condition, is that we are insatiable appetites for information.
So, can I add one thing? I'll stay short. To your question as to the nature of these relationships, I don't think that they were hostile. And the reason I don't think the trysts between Neanderthals and humans were hostile is, one, there's been some proposals that there was an exchange of cultural information. I mentioned the acquisition of fiber knots in Neanderthals after humans. So it seems that humans figured this out and potentially transferred it to Neanderthals. Not only that, but given the lack of violent support for violent conflict between these two, I just don't think that it would have been particularly hostile, because we have examples of paleopathology of blunt force trauma at Cima de los Huesos where there's only Neanderthals. They fought with each other. Humans fought with each other. But we don't have any support that we fought with one another. We don't find these wounding patterns where they're contemporaneous, if that makes sense. So I'm not saying that they weren't ever hostile, but I don't think that there's support to say that they were, at least not right now.
Okay, we're going to go to questions here real soon, but Kyle's the only one who hasn't given a talk. I'm going to give him the last word over here. A couple minutes.
Oh, okay. I'd like to talk to maybe your question, Erica, about non-Christian ways of kind of the human exceptionalism we've been talking about. In the philosophy of mind, there's all these arguments for the existence of the soul. When I say soul, I mean something immaterial about humans. And one thing that I don't bring up in the humans versus animals debate is, in philosophy of mind, they talk about qualia, which is a really weird term, but it's this term that describes what it is likeness to of our conscious experience, right? So like, say I look at a red apple, and what it is like to experience the color red would be like the qualia that we're talking about. What's really fun and what we talk about in philosophy class is how there's qualia. It's infamous for not being something that you can explain physically, right? If I asked you what is redness, or if I was colorblind from birth and I asked you, what is red? You could point to red things, but you can't physically explain it. Like there's underlying physical things with color cognition, but the qualia of redness is, a lot of people argue it's some kind of immaterial thing about us. But the thing is, we think animals are conscious. So we don't talk about it as much during the humans versus animals debate. But there really is that. It goes all the way back to ancient philosophy with Plato and Aristotle, with the debates over what are universals. Redness itself, like what we talk about in metaphysics, is what is redness. I might have a red apple, I might have a red fire truck. We talk about, physical things can't be in more than one place at a time. So what is redness? What is that? You know, and the answer in metaphysics is it's a property. But if I take a human being, for example, when I look at a singular human being, you know, and over time I observe a lot of humans, I come to know what humanity is, the essence of what it is to be a human. But if I'm thinking about, or if I'm remembering someone I saw, that one person is not humanity itself. Whenever I understand humanness, humanity, it's this universal, this essence that ancient and medieval philosophers thought that there's something immaterial about that. And that's kind of the precedent for the rational animal distinction. And what's so fascinating about what we've been talking about this weekend is that, you know, like what Aristotle said, we're rational animals. So there is going to be a lot of continuity because we are animals. You know, if I'm gonna do a syllogism like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, I have to have a physical body to be able to even do that in the first place. But what the medievals and the ancient philosophers would say is that I need this immaterial intellect to retain the universal concepts that are abstract themselves for me to even, the medievals called it the three acts of the mind: simple apprehension, judgment, and reasoning. And they just thought that this ability to know abstract objects was, I think, is so interesting because it gets to the generalist specialist kind of distinction y'all are kind of touching on. That's why they thought it was that way. And what happens is, in the history of philosophy, Christian philosophers kind of brought that up, took what Aristotle started with and kind of what they call baptized it and modified it here and there. But there's reasons for believing that. Do I have time to ask Erica and Nathan a question?
We need to go to the we've got a lot of people out here who want to ask questions, and I want to give them time. But your comments about philosophy warmed my heart. So. All right.
Are strangely warmed.
We want to give you an opportunity to ask questions, and so you can ask questions here, but you need to go to the microphone. Your questions need to be concise. You need to speak right into the microphone. Also, people in the live stream will be sending their questions. So George will be reading those, and we'll have some responses. So let's go to the microphone if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, question I'd like all of you to discuss is this. I remember you all been talking about how we humans tend to anthropomorphize the animals. We're going to hear in the second session, we also anthropomorphize even machines. So that's a bias we have. But what about the bias of human pride? How every generation thinks they're smarter than the generation that preceded us. And how does this impact anthropology in the sense that we look back 10, 20, 30,000 years and say, look how stupid they were? Are we guilty of a bias? Are we also guilty of not taking into account what I call the Ice Age bias? That once you get into the Ice Age, you've got extreme climate instability. Isn't that going to hamper the capability of both humans and potentially Neanderthals to express what they have? And there's a carbon dioxide bias. They're having to deal with an environment where there's only 180 parts of carbon dioxide per million in the atmosphere. That's really going to limit the ability to gather food compared to what we're dealing with today. And then another bias I'd like you to discuss is, you know, these animals are really important for our ability to launch civilization. We know that because on continents like Australia, where certain animals were wiped out when humans came in, they never amounted to much. How does that impact their technological development? And what about the fact that maybe these animals are really designed to relate to us? Wouldn't that explain the similarities they have? And what if they're also designed to assist us in launching civilization? What about that factor? And I could name another 6 biases, but it makes me so grateful that I chose a simple science. And what this conference has taught me, anthropology is way, way more complicated compared to astrophysics than I ever dreamed it was before this conference happened. So, but all these biases, I think, make it enormously more complicated. I'd like to hear your comments.
So C.S. Lewis talked about chronological snobbery, that people in the contemporary world think they're a whole lot smarter than people who came before. Who'd like to address, Hugh had a number of questions in there. He snuck in a number of them. Who'd like to address one or two of those?
I would just say, I don't think we're smarter than other generations, but we do know more. So I think that's okay to admit. We do.
I'd like
we
to
knew
talk.
what they knew, plus.
I'd like to talk about the importance of other animals, and I want to talk about one of my favorite animals, dogs.
Yeah.
We share that. I've got 3 dogs. There's a really fascinating hypothesis that I don't know where it's gone since, but it was initially put forward by Pat Shipman, and she actually suggested that it was the domestication of dogs that helped Homo sapiens outcompete Neanderthals, because we start to see the emergence of these kind of wolf-dog hybridy looking things right around 40,000 years ago, probably a little bit earlier than that, because we're just talking about our first evidence for it. And that's right when Neanderthals go extinct. So the idea that she put forward is that, you know, humans show up with dogs. Dogs help us hunt bigger game. They help us sniff out better game. They help us track prey. They help us keep other predators from stealing our food because they stand guard and stand watch. I wonder, I mean, I think dogs are enormously influential. They're the first animal we domesticated by tens of thousands of years. So I want to give the dogs some credit for where we are today.
To your point about chronological snobbery, Nathan is right. We do have so much more information now than the ancients did, but they were not stupid. All one has to do, you know, so many of the discussions we're having here today, one can find where, you know, Lucretius and the Epicureans and the Stoics were having remarkably sophisticated conversations that really is covering a lot of the terrain that we're covering here today. So, yeah, I think we need to appreciate our heritage and respect that. I don't have I mean, I would like to hear more about the impact of the Ice Age and Ice Ages have had on the development. I agree with you about the dogs.
Okay, George, how about a question from streaming?
If we could resurrect a biological Neanderthal today, would it have basically human capabilities and learn to function basically like a human?
I would argue that it would be a lot closer than we probably think. Yeah, I think most of the differences in how we act and behave now are because of what we've accumulated as a culture. And I think I'm partially bolstered by that belief is there are uncontacted hunter-gatherer tribes that still exist to this day, right? And they have such a low amount of cultural knowledge and wisdom, but they're not stupider than us. I hope no one would think that, right? They just haven't built all this, technology for cultural, accumulation of knowledge. So yeah, I think that I'm not saying they could substitute perfectly for a human. I mean, they would be different. I'm sure. I'd be really fascinating to know how they would be different.
Yeah, and that's the question I've had. I mean, that's the great question. It really is the question that's on my mind. If they were resurrected and somehow we're here, let's say that we were able to clone one because we got the DNA and we're able to do that. Could that little Neanderthal child go to school and learn the alphabet? That's the question we're asking, isn't it?
I mean, I think almost certainly they could learn the alphabet. I think that the differences are going to be minor and more cultural than anything else. I saw a very interesting take that was just completely speculative, of course, but someone was musing, what would the sense of humor for Neanderthals be like? They had a heavy emphasis on the occipital lobe, like I said, which is great for the hand-eye coordination, but lacking in the parietal and in the frontal in comparison. So the researcher was like, maybe they would have been more interested in like slapstick comedy, the Three Stooges.
So they would like the Three Stooges.
Yeah, the Three Stooges, and maybe that would be the case. But as far as like they survived for, if we're taking the later date, 760,000 years. That is a long time. You have to have an extreme knowledge of the world around you and even cultural understanding in order to live successfully as a species for that long. I do think that.
So during that long period, do you see any type of evolutionary development in them?
You do. You see the acquisition in certain morphologic characteristics. So initially there's this more generic version that we used to call Homo heidelbergensis. I was telling you about that a minute ago. But it's kind of a wastebasket taxa just because a lot of things that look kind of like early Homo sapiens, kind of like, they're kind of like, yeah, it's heidelbergensis. But it's like, I don't know that you can say that because the distinguishing characteristics haven't emerged yet. They get an occipital bun, a retromolar gap. They get a larger nasal aperture, which some have, that's a nose hole, which some have proposed help them warm the air in the colder climates that they lived in. They've got a robust, stockier build, stronger bones, but flatter feet, so they wouldn't have been capable of nearly the endurance capabilities that humans are capable of. We are one of the best long-distance runners on the planet of any animal, which is really quite remarkable, and I don't think we give ourselves credit for enough. We can literally, hunter-gatherers today can literally hunt an antelope to exhaustion over the course of several hours, which is a feat that I personally could never do, but I'm glad our species has that going for us.
No, but you could if you grew up that way.
Right, precisely.
Yeah, and that's the difference. And Hugh's point about the Ice Age is actually really important and dovetails with what you just said, because the Ice Age was much harsher on the northern hemisphere. And our ancestors are African. We are an African species, very, very African species. And so while the climate change was real, it was different and it was nowhere near as harsh. So what Neanderthals had to do was double down on all of those adaptations that made them able to survive those harsh climates. Small groups helped, and all of that. But again, that's sort of the opposite direction of being the generalist that we were able to stay as generalists, and they had to double down on their specialization. So
And to your point, I want to touch on one more thing that's really important and might hold part of the key as to why we're here and they're not. Our brains are smaller, but they're quite efficient at what they do. Neanderthals had these big brains, and whether or not the neuronal density of those big brains is kind of a side point, the bigger the brain, the more energy it requires. They would have had to eat significantly more calories than us every day just to stay running. And when you're talking about an ice age where the megafauna are barely, eking out of living themselves, these Neanderthals are working 24/7, and they lived in small groups. Which you talked about the division of labor. One thing that's interesting that I mentioned to a couple of people is that Neanderthal males and females, they don't seem to have a discrimination in the wounds that they have, which suggests that because they lived in small groups, it wasn't that females gathered and males hunted. It was all hands on deck because they had to be. And the most modern analog for the types of wounds that they have is modern day rodeo riders, which makes you wonder, what on earth were these guys doing? They encountered a woolly rhino and they're like riding it on the back or something. But so they've got to eat more, there's less to go around, the climate is harsher, they've got no cultural exchange, they're highly inbred, which means like a ton of genetic anomalies are building up, and even still, they lasted 760,000 years. Yeah.
Buzz.
I think, physically you wouldn't see significant differences other than some of the things that Erica pointed out. I think that cognitively there would be significant differences.
So would you agree or disagree with their statement about the Neanderthal could learn the ABCs?
I don't know how to. I would tend to say probably not.
Okay. How many home runs would they hit?
But that mattered more to them.
Okay. You got to go to the microphone if you want to ask a question. Line up if you'd like to ask questions.
Thank you, speakers and RTV for hosting this. It's very illuminating. Yes, I come from the human exceptionalism side, and it's good to hear the other side, and appreciate Dr. Ross and Fuzz for giving us the other side, and we want to hear more of that. Having said that, it all goes back to the Darwin statement, are we different in degree or kind? And he says that even though the difference is great, it's still a matter of degree. But let's say the animal to be compared to a bottle of water, and we to the ocean. Now the new evidence says animals more like a swimming pool. And as a result, we are figuring out and confirming by empirical evidence and physics, this empirical evidence very needed, that we are coming closer than properties and a lot of other physical and chemistry. But does that eliminate the fact there are huge areas which a swimming pool doesn't have? Can it fit a ship? Can you have a whole flotilla of ships going through it? And I'm surprised those who are from the human exception, they don't emphasize, is there in the animal world a 425-bed hospital or a judiciary system or Oxford University? Maybe there is some remnants of Oxford University among chimpanzees or dogs, which I'm waiting to see. But, I mean, there's a whole range besides all the technology achievements. I mean, yes, picking up a little instrument and trying to pick up food may be a glimpse of the precursor. That's a great word. But there's no comparison to the slaughter we human beings, and I'm very disappointed in my own species that they slaughtered the Nazis over the Jews, the Stalin over the Orthodox Christians, and so on, the whole list. So does the ocean being different from a swimming pool, is that a continuum or difference? So please explain.
Who wants to, you want to start, Nate? You want me to?
I'll just say two things. There are, like I said before, uncontacted tribes, and there's no sign of Oxford University coming out of those either. But no one says they're stupid and they're not less than human or anything like that. They just haven't had, that cumulative culture. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that there's also an enormous difference in a 6-month-old child and a 40-year-old adult. But we don't, and so much so in what they can do that you might be tempted, if they were to be stuck that way, that they would be differences in kind, right? But we know that there are differences in degree and that they can develop on that. So what we're emphasizing is just that continuity. If you just pictured childhood development as evolutionary development, it's not like there's just these harsh lines that this is that and that's that. You don't go to sleep a child and wake up an adult. It's all just continuous. So that's the side of it.
Let me ask you this, Nathan, because we do affirm there is so much continuity. I mean, we are flesh and blood. We are creatures, but you acknowledged also the hockey stick. Mm-hmm. Is there some point on the hockey stick that you say, okay, that's a difference in kind? I mean, again, this goes back to what I was talking about last night, the difficulty of just defining kind. What we mean when we say this difference is so distinct. And it goes, I think that's what Sudendorf was trying to argue in his book, on the book on the gap. Yes, there are these, but to our dear brothers, it's comparing a swimming pool and the ocean. Can you perceive, or is there something that you'd say, okay, this is really truly different, or will you still say, okay, it's still just a continuum?
Can I speak to an
go
example with that,
Yeah.
just while he's thinking?
Yeah.
So everyone here, we're all down with there's aspects that are absolutely continuum. I think Nate and I would just say all of it is, while you might say only most of it is, or there are aspects that are critical that aren't. To your point about sort of a swimming pool versus the ocean, I do think there's a difference there, but I think it's more like comparing Lake Tanganyika, a really big lake in Tanzania and Kenya, to Lake Victoria, which is a significantly larger lake, but closer than a swimming pool versus an ocean. And to your point about like Oxford Hospital, to speak to that, I didn't get a chance to talk about this anecdote by Fazale again in my talk, but he was watching these chimpanzees, and there's this old female living in one of the colonies that he watched. She's very feeble and infirm, very old for a chimp, like 59 or something along those lines. It wasn't Mama, but it was it might have been Peony. Anyways, a younger female would see that she was struggling, like when she was moving around, and they'd wait for her and stuff like that. But what was most striking is that when she would get up to go to the water hose to get a drink from the water hose, the younger female would race ahead of her, fill her mouth up with water, race back, and spit the water into her mouth over and over and over again so that she wouldn't have to get up and go to the water hose. And I think about that, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that's not Oxford Hospital, but it's certainly a precursor to care. And then we look to the fossil record, and we see, the old man with the sockets that are closed, and Dmanisi. We look at old Neanderthals who have massive tumors that would have severely impacted their mobility, that have grown in their skulls, and yet they live to old ages because their group mates are caring for them. These aren't hospitals, but they're the precursors to it. So, you know, my point is that it's like, again, to your case with the uncontacted tribes, I bet the folks on Sentinel Island, which is an uncontacted tribe, care for their sick. They don't build a hospital. But that doesn't mean that their capacity to care is less. It just means that they don't have access to our cultural information. So I'd propose, again, a continuum.
Let me ask, Nathan, I'd like to ask you a question. It seems to me that, you know, when we talk about tools, we talk about inventions. I mean, one of the things that human beings have come up with is the natural sciences themselves, which seems exponentially above other things.
And mathematics.
When intelligent people want answers to questions, they look to logic, they look to mathematics, they look to science. Is it possible these things are so above what we see in the animal kingdom that you may want to say it's exceptional?
Well, just for the record, I do think we are exceptional. But in the way that everything is exceptional, and I guess if everything's exceptional, nothing's exceptional. I do think the word exceptional has a lot of baggage associated. I think that's what we're talking about here. And I actually, in my new book, I talk a lot about how when the categories and the words and the labels are getting in the way, they're the problem. That we're debating categories and labels. But yes, you're right, the natural sciences. But I do see the natural sciences and even mathematics as an extension of that curiosity, that natural curiosity, combined with, you know, a big brain. So I don't see it as like totally dropped down, you know, from outer space. I think it's an extension. Yes, it's a quite a wide gap. But as Eric has pointed out many, many times, the gap looks bigger than it is because we're missing everything between us. Like over the last 7 million years, lots of things have been on their way to that, right? And we're the only ones left, and chimpanzees don't have anything like that, but other things did, you know, so.
Well, and just to add one last thing to that point, because I want to get this thought out there, you know, it's often been said that some of the early humans were like the first naturalists and that they knew the world around them. They knew what kinds of food they could eat, what kinds of plants they could eat, when things grew, when animals bred, which areas of the river were safe to drink from which portions of the year. And they knew this because it was life or death. But is that really so different than a basic version of categorizing the world around us, of doing what Linnaeus did and categorizing creation to understand it in and of itself?
Yeah.
But, I mean, to think about the universal laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the law of identity, the idea, you know, somebody like Einstein could come up with an equation in his mind that would correspond to the nature of reality. Even if there is the problem with labels, it doesn't seem like a degree. It seems like now we're in a different category.
Okay, but if Einstein had been born 100 years before, he wouldn't have done anything that he did. If he had been born 100 years before that, right? So because you can't just drop Einstein into an uncontacted tribe and he's going to discover special relativity, right? He was building on what we have all collectively done to get to that moment, right? So that's what I mean when I say it seems like a big gulf because we're missing all the steps that came before, but you know, Isaac Newton, you know, articulated an intuitive sense of the world that we were all working on as a species. We all understood if you throw this, it goes a certain amount of time and comes down. He put some equations on an intuitive wisdom that was building gradually and would have built it. So I don't think, so here's the question then. Is Einstein exceptional, or is he just a really good example of the way we all are?
But it seems to me that, you know, the fact that this cultural evolution in technology is even possible in humans goes beyond just simply population size, and with that kind of the capacity to accumulate knowledge. It seems like there's something else beyond just simply population size that's triggering that kind of exponential explosion in knowledge that allows somebody like Einstein, who's positioned at the right time, to make those kinds of important insights.
I mean, I think it depends on like when we're looking at, right? Because like when brain case size first starts to explode in Homo erectus, it corresponds like very close. We were talking about this at lunch, but it corresponds very closely with the addition of meat into the diet, a highly energetic food. And you know, more meat fuels a bigger brain. You can innovate more tools, so you can get more meat, so you can get a bigger brain, so you create this nice feedback loop of intelligence and brain growth. You smash through that great ceiling. But you're still building on what was before. And if you're talking about like later with Neanderthals, I agree. Again, like we've talked on Twitter about transketolase like 1. It's this mutation. It triples the radial glial cells. That's really impressive. But it's tripling a gene, or it's substituting on a gene that was already there. You see, it's a precursor. It would be my argument.
Right.
Okay,
Sorry.
Joe, come to the microphone and ask your question.
Is a creature able to have abstract thought without language? To speak to what we're talking about now, does language allow us to bundle cause and effect, relationships, and ideas? Is language absolutely necessary for abstract thought?
I think in our next session we're going to have someone who is a philosopher of mind. Is that correct?
I don't remember.
Yeah. Yes. I was thinking Sean, that's a great question about a philosophy of mind. And I would argue, you know, my understanding is the answer is yes. That in order to, you know, that language is necessary. So, but it could be that Erica or Nathan would disagree with me.
Yeah, I come down on the side that language is not necessary for thought, but it really shapes it and even constrains it actually in very specific ways. And so the abstract thought, the symbolism separate from language, I think, and also I don't think there was any advantage for language without that. So I think you had to have that. It serves some other function first, that ability in the brain to have symbolism, referential, you know, stand-ins, concepts, abstract. That had to do something, because it pre-existed, it had to. So I think that it's kind of a necessary precondition to language, not the other way around. That's how I would say it.
I think that may be one of the questions he's getting at, and the kind of point we've been trying to ask is that it seems like we've evolved way beyond what we need to. In other words, if what we're doing is figuring out a way to eat better and reproduce better, and yet we have you exploring chimpanzees and Einstein coming up with the theory of relativity, that seems to go just orders of magnitude above just simple survival.
The endowment.
Yeah, it's just so much more than we needed from a Darwinian perspective.
Well, you know, I've been playing around a bit with the argument from beauty, and part of that is, can you account for the origin of our aesthetic sense through evolutionary models? And it's, you know, it's a real struggle. Let's just put it this way, when you go into the literature. And part of the problem is that we are obsessed with making art. It's not that we just do it on the side when we got time. We actually restructure everything we do to be able to make art. So here's a place where our symbolic capacity actually undermines, at least in that sense, undermines our ability to survive, right? And that's kind of the mystery from an evolutionary perspective is how do you there's no advantage to making art, at least, you know, at least that's evident or apparent. Now people try some adaptionist ideas and things like that, but they all seem to kind of not quite account for it. So that's to your point, right? That it's not just that we study chimpanzees and create general relativity, but we make art, we make music, we spend all of our time looking and contemplating the art and the music that other people make.
We're upset. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think
Religion.
Yeah. Well, it is the question. I mean, we are compulsive meaning makers and finders. I mean, we constantly, I mean, you know, of course, I realize that evolutionary biology would argue, or evolutionary psychology would argue that God is the cosmic cheat detector and things of that nature, that you know, there's evolutionary reasons for the rise of religion. I find them rather reductionistic. And I think, okay, maybe that describes the religious impulses of some, but not most that I know. There's something so much more going on that just transcends the sense of mysticism or the sense of I'm going to get punished if I do wrong. There's something so incredibly satisfying and meaningful to a Christian that it's really rather inexplicable to say, okay, I really do believe that the chief purpose of man is to know God and enjoy Him forever, and I find that just doesn't seem to fit any kind of explanation. I mean, I've read the various evolutionary psychology books, and none of them seem to describe what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I have opinions on this kind of stuff, but it starts getting into the realm of, like, I could speculate about it all day long.
Yeah.
I could say, well, maybe it's the innate curiosity again. Maybe it's the fact that we see thunder in the sky and people think, wow, if I was up in the sky, and when I clap my hands together, it makes a really loud sound. If I was up in the sky, I would probably clap my hands together and it would make a sound that loud. Maybe there's a person like me up in the sky who shares characteristics with me, and maybe that's where animism comes from, people assigning, anthropomorphizing nature. I don't know. I have no idea. I think it's fascinating that basically every culture has religion. I think that's fascinating. There's a curiosity there that, to me, speaks to our desire to know more, whatever that may be. We want to seek more.
Yeah, and it isn't just more. We want to know the ultimate. In other words, what is that which is beyond everything else? I mean, that's really what that is the motivating about, it isn't just that. And I get what you're saying, that there's so many deities. This is the deity that makes the water run, or this is the deity for the cows. I mean, in the ancient world they had, that's one of the things I hear. They'll say, well, do you believe in any of the Norse gods or the Greek gods or whatever? And I'll say no. And they'll say, well, there's 10,000 gods you don't believe in. I just don't believe in 10,001. And so therefore, because I don't believe in the Christian God. And I would say, well, congratulations, you're almost up to the level of the Old Testament prophets. Because that was the point that they were making, is that we're not just talking about an imminent thing. We're talking about that which is beyond. And I would say that for you as an agnostic, and for Nathan, you still have something in your mind. You say, this is the ultimate way things are.
Paul Tillich said everyone has an ultimate concern.
Yeah,
even
and so I would say, I would just ask you to examine, what is that which I understand to be ultimate? I've had people say, well, it's the quantum field, or whatever it is that they say, and this is ultimate. That's really what we're talking about here. Is what is that which is ultimate?
Okay, Ross, question.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everybody. This is fantastic. So Erica, you asked what is. Can you name something that's more different in kind? And I think it kind of goes to what you guys are talking about here. Human beings, we have this sort of general unsettledness, right, that the animals don't have. My dog, if he eats and he goes outside and poops in the dirt and I pet him, he is as happy as any dog in the history of dogs, right? That's just what he needs. That's it. It's very simple. But we need to be able to understand. We need to be able to ask why. We need, I call it, we need to worship. Even people that don't believe in God, we have this need to escalate something to a transcendent place. We're not happy just eating and pooping and getting petted, right? And then there's all this bad stuff that comes with it, right? We have the ability to hate, to destroy, just for the sake of taking it apart, for no social good, even to the point where it can be self-destructive. I'll destroy myself sometimes. And it just seems to me, let's see, what else do I have here? I think that pretty much covers it. It seems to me that desire that we have for something transcendent, which as a Christian we believe is what's built into us to desire God, is a difference in kind. I don't see anything like that in the animal kingdom, and if you guys could comment on that.
Oh, no.
And time is short. 3 o'clock, we're going to take a 10-minute break, so very concise answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that does speak to exactly what we've been talking about here. I mean, again, Nate and I, neither of us are going to sit up here and tell you that the fact that we're sitting here discussing this isn't remarkable, and nothing else is doing this. But my question is, would anything else, if they were still here, right, can we see that continuity? Certainly, maybe not in some places in space. Like I said, chimps don't appreciate death the way that we do. I would argue that they definitely hate and love, but do they understand in the same way that we do? I don't think so. I think there is a difference there. Again, perhaps not superior and inferior, who am I to say? But I would propose that we are kind of a culmination of this appreciation, this curiosity, this desire to know, this desire to conquer and expand and learn and seek. We're a culmination of that today, even in this very room. I think that's one of the reasons humans as a species have been so successful, even after Neanderthals fall by the wayside and Denisovans goes extinct and Floresiensis vanishes and Naledi is gone from the south. We're still here wondering about why we're the only ones left. I think that's very special, but I don't think that there's ample support at this juncture to say that even though we're the only ones still doing this, that we were the only ones who ever did or were approaching that.
Fuzz, take a minute and tell us, sum it up for us here.
What's remarkable to me is how much we all agree and at the same time how much we all disagree on this topic. You know, so I just thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I don't know that I've got anything profound to offer in terms of summing it up, other than, again, it's this has been a remarkable conversation, and there's places where the agreement is surprising, and places where the disagreement is surprising.
I would just simply say it's to have Erica and Nathan come to share their thoughts. This has really been a great learning experience. And I think it's RTB at its best when we bring in people who can vocalize a different perspective, a different worldview. So please recognize how much we appreciate you.
Oh, I know it's our pleasure. I'll speak for myself. It's my pleasure. So please as well.